Sounds like society back then pretty much knew that these beings existed. Hey guys, welcome back to Safe Skeptic. I'm Josh, and I have uncovered some amazing evidence that supports the biblical account of the Nephilim. We're going to look at this relatively unknown archaeological evidence that affirms the biblical account of these beings actually existing on the earth. And finally, we'll look at whether the Nephilim will return in the last days, and there is actually surprisingly good evidence for this. Some even think they already live among us. Now, if you don't know who the Nephilim are, they are these beings mentioned first in Genesis 6:4, showing up right before the flood, and their story has fascinated people for centuries, including me. The verse in question says that, quote, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown." Now, the sons of God is usually interpreted in two ways. Some think it refers to fallen angels who came down and had children with human women, which led to the birth of the Nephilim. Others think sons of God might mean powerful men, rulers, or the descendants of Seth, Adam and Eve's good son. The Nephilim themselves are described as giants or mighty warriors, kind of like legendary figures. And I personally believe in Michael Heiser's supernatural view that the Nephilim were the result of fallen angels having relations with human women. There's a ton of evidence that we can look at to support this idea. I mean, look at the scripture from 2 Peter 4. It says, "For if God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell, and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment, and spared not the old world, but saved Noah, the eighth person, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood upon the world of the ungodly." Notice how Peter connects the angels sinning with the flood. Or we can look at Jude, which says, "And the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, he is kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day." So what is going on with these angels? Now, in the book of Enoch, which isn't part of biblical canon for most traditions, but it was quoted by Jude and still provides us with compelling background information circling in society in ancient days. So the book of Enoch fleshes this story out even further. Enoch talks about these rebellious angels, called the Watchers, who descended to earth, fell in love or lust with human women, and had these giant offspring, the Nephilim. Now, these giants were supposedly huge. They were destructive and totally uncontrollable, which added to the corruption of the world before the flood. The book of Enoch even names some of the Watchers like Samyaza and Azazel and describes how they not only corrupted humanity with these hybrid offspring, but also taught humans all kinds of forbidden knowledge like weapon making, sorcery, and even astrology. The sin that resulted in this got so intense that God decided to cleanse the earth with the flood. People debate how literal or symbolic all of this is. Some see it as mythology mixed with theology. Others think it's ancient alien stuff. And then there are those who, like me and many other students of the Bible, take it at face value as an historical truth. What makes the Nephilim even more fascinating is that they are mentioned again after the flood, like in Numbers 13:33, when the Israelite spies scouting Canaan see giants and are terrified. They say they're like grasshoppers to them. Obviously, I don't believe the giants survived the flood. So perhaps these spies were either exaggerating, or more likely, we have a repeat event of what took place before the flood. And because God promised not to flood the earth again, he tasked the Israelites with removing this evil from the earth. You know, it's very interesting that these beings would pop up again in the Holy Land, where God's plan was to bring a Messiah of pure blood, without blemish, with no sin in his heart, to redeem mankind. Okay, so now we're going to look at this article from the Armstrong Institute of Archaeology titled, "Were There Giants in Canaan After All?" The author examines the connection between biblical references and evidence from ancient Egypt and Canaan, and it's fascinating stuff. Now, as we're reading this article, think about the implications of this reality. Could the presence of giants in Canaan explain why God commanded their destruction during their conquest of the land? Some scholars suggest their existence posed more than just a physical threat. If the Nephilim and their descendants were associated with divine rebellion, as Heiser claims, they could also represent a spiritual corruption that threatened the purity of the messianic bloodline promised through Israel. By removing these groups, God's plan for redemption through the Messiah could remain untainted, preserving the lineage that's so important to biblical prophecy. All right, so let's take a look. Were there giants in Canaan after all? Corroboration for the biblical account from contemporary ancient sources. Let's go down here. The Bible is famous for its account of Levantine giants. Goliath was 6 cubits and a span, or over 9 feet tall, according to 1 Samuel 17:4. The giant Og's 13-foot-long bed actually became a museum piece in the biblical account in Deuteronomy. An ancient mercenary is described as being 7.5 feet tall in 1 Chronicles. Tall tribes like the Anakim, Nephilim, and Rephaim terrified the Israelite spies scouting the Promised Land. The spies over-dramatized them as making the Israelites look like grasshoppers in comparison to persuade the Israelites to turn back to Egypt. That was in Numbers. Giants in Canaan are easily passed off as fanciful biblical myths, but did you know that there is contemporary material detailing the existence and even heights of giants of the Levant? Papyrus Anastasi I is an Egyptian literary text from the 19th dynasty around the 13th century BCE. It is a scribal training sheet that includes numerous important historical details about the early Levant, including the names of towns throughout Canaan and Syria. The text mentions a Levantine tribe called Shasu and its warriors. Quote, the valley region is infested with Shasu. Some of them are of 4 cubits or of 5 cubits from head to foot, fierce of face, their heart is not mild, and they hearken not to coaxing. They don't sound like very appealing individuals to be around. That may not mean anything to a modern reader, but to Egyptians familiar with their royal cubit length, that was a truly impressive size. In modern terminology, 4 to 5 Egyptian cubits is from just under 7 feet to 8 feet, 7 inches tall. Now we're talking about giant beings, but not like the ones we've seen, like we see today, where people have gigantism and they can barely move and they have health issues. These were genetically built to be this tall. There is also the depiction of Shasu captives on an Egyptian wall relief depicting the Battle of Kadesh circa 1274 BCE. It shows 2 captured Shasu spies being beaten by a horde of Egyptians. Often in such ancient artwork, national dominance was shown by the size of the individuals depicted. Note the classic examples of massive pharaohs defeating their enemies. This is true. They did exaggerate their size. But isn't it odd that they're exaggerating the size of their enemy, making themselves look small? That's kind of goes against traditional Egyptian thought, I would think. But this Kadesh image depicts in very realistic style large Shasu males compared to their victorious Egyptian counterparts. Thus, together with Papyrus Anastasi I, highlighting members of Shasu society as reaching very tall heights. Still, little is known about the Shasu people. The earliest known reference dates to a Levantine peoples list from the 15th century BCE. We know from 13th century BCE Pharaoh Merneptah's inscription that they were on the scene at the same time as the early Israelites. Egyptian artwork depicts them dressed in a clearly Canaanite manner. The Kadesh inscriptions relate that they served in a limited mercenary sense alongside the Hittites. What's interesting about the Hittites is that everyone said that they were a myth. They did not exist until recent archaeological history. I don't know what year it was. They discovered the Hittite nation, and all of the skeptics, all of the scholarly people that are so smart had to basically eat crow, So people talk about these giants as never existing in its mythological, but you know what we see over and over again is that the Bible is constantly confirmed to be true when we look at archaeological evidence. And it is even true, you can look this up, that archaeologists working in the Middle East, they do look at the scriptures to find out where their future digs could be. And because the scriptures have been so accurately stating historical fact that they continue to rely on them to this day. 13th century BCE Egyptian texts relate 6 different tribes of Shasu. Perhaps all or only certain of them were predisposed to reach tall statures. Whatever the case, they lived specifically in the Southern Levant, in the region of the Philistines, Canaan, and Transjordan, thus fitting with the biblical locations of giant peoples. Interesting that it's in the same place and the same time as the Bible states. I mean, talk about corroborating evidence here. It's pretty fascinating that you can find these completely separate historical accounts confirming each other. Now, if this hadn't related to the Bible, you know that archaeologists, that scholars would all say this is something that definitely happened. No, but because it was in the Bible, it's not enough evidence. They also disappear from the archaeological record during the early Iron Age, late biblical Judges, early Kings period, the same time in which the biblical references to them end. The association by the Anastasi Papyrus with the Levantine Valley region is interesting given the Bible specifically highlights a valley of Rephaim, one of the giant tribes, famous to this day as the bustling Emek Rephaim, which descends from Jerusalem. There are several other extra-biblical references. The early 2nd millennium BCE Egyptian execration texts named the people of Anak, the same title given in the Bible, Numbers 13:33, Anak meaning giant. And as for the biblical giant Og, he is referenced in a later circa 500 BCE Phoenician inscription as the mighty Og. Sounds like society back then pretty much knew that these beings existed and everybody was reporting about them. Og was a king of the Rephaim based at Ashtaroth and Edrei, i.e. Joshua 13:12. A circa 1200 BC Canaanite tablet from Ugarit mentions a deified great king Rapiu, a name etymologically linked to Rephaim in the singular form. Wow. So it quotes, "May Rapiu, king of eternity, drink wine, the god enthroned in Ashtaroth, the god who rules in Edrei." So the combination of names Rapia, Ashtaroth, and Edrei are a remarkable link to the biblical account of Og and the Rephaim. Could it even be a reference to this king himself? It has been suggested that Og was simply a regal title meaning man of valor, paralleling other Ugaritic and Canaanite titles. The list of extra-biblical parallels could go on. It's easy to pass off some of the earliest biblical accounts as simple myth, but even when it comes to giants, the biblical record holds alongside the archaeological evidence. Wow, fascinating stuff. But if you look at the broader implications of this, and the fact that there were these societies experiencing these giants, these Nephilim, it kind of makes sense that all of the other cultures outside of Israel had created their own gods, right? You have the Greek gods and you have others as well. Who, I mean, they didn't just come out of thin air, right? Like one day someone just said, like, came up with Zeus, right? Like maybe these have historical origins relating back to these men of renown who then later became to more mythical proportions and became gods. Because if you think about, if they had these extra abilities, they had this knowledge, of course people are going to look up to them as their gods. And then as the generations go on, their myths build, and they have these fascinating gods that they worship and they think that are going to save them when in fact their very gods that they did worship are dead or are in chains of darkness. So it's clear that we have this explicit mention of giants in the archaeological record, but there's also other monuments. If you look at the pyramids of Giza, Baalbek's massive stone blocks, the walls of Pumapunka, all of which show this technical sophistication that really seems impossible for humans, even almost for today. Perhaps we're looking at structures built by the Nephilim mentioned in the Bible, structures that even modern ingenuity would have trouble with. So this leads to our final question. Will the Nephilim return in the last days? And why do so many people think this is the case? Well, in Matthew 24:37, Jesus warns his disciples that as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. We have to also remember that Jesus said to not be deceived over and over again. Of course, he's talking about false teachers, false prophets, but could it also be false beings, false gods, right? Satan disguising himself as an angel of light. I mean, it seems a major deception is coming, and the most obvious culprit is society's recent fascination with aliens. I mean, scientists are literally obsessed with finding life on other planets, while the rest of society almost seems to be begging for it to be true. And now we have former government officials admitting that these beings are real, with Congress taking these claims seriously on a global stage. What is happening? Sightings of larger-than-life craft breaking the laws of physics points to these objects as being supernatural, not extraterrestrial. At least that's my opinion. So we have to ask, why are these beings so interested in us right now? I believe we could attribute them to demonic activity of some sort, coming again, but this time to deceive the masses into believing in a false Messiah, otherwise known as the Antichrist. and also to corrupt God's good creation like before the flood. And we have to look at the numerous accounts of people throughout recent history report being abducted by aliens and either being tested on or even experiencing some sort of spiritual SA. Could these aliens be preparing to once again corrupt the human bloodline to thwart God's plan of salvation? Who knows? But we do know that Satan can never create on his own. He can only pervert what God has already made good. And it's not just the perversion of the human bloodline. According to Enoch, the Watchers, or the fallen angels, not only corrupted humans, but also sinned against animals, possibly involving the creation of hybrid creatures. I mean, have you ever wondered where the ideas of sphinxes came from? Minotaurs, mermaids, trolls, ogres, sprites, fairies, sirens, I mean, the list goes on. It's likely that these beings did not just come up out of thin air, that there's some sort of historical precedent for it. But if you think this is something of the past, you're wrong, because recently, in fact, in 2019, researchers announced the first human monkey chimera embryo was created in China with the goal of creating human organs for transplants. But we can all see where this is going. And I'm sure God is not happy with these scientists perverting his good creation. And this is just what we know about. I'm sure there are far more instances of this sort of hybrid breeding going on under the radar. But then we also have this stuff going on right in front of us that has become culturally normal, like the history of genetically modifying food, crossbreeding. For thousands of years, people have been shaping plants and animals to suit their needs. By the 2010s, CRISPR technology made precise gene editing possible, and then cloning emerged alongside these developments, with the first major breakthrough coming in 1996 when Dolly the sheep became the first mammal cloned from an adult cell. I mean, what it looks like to me is these advancements look a lot like the events described in Genesis 6 in the story of the Nephilim. And society, it appears, is being conditioned to find this sort of thing normal. I mean, just as the Watchers were seen as tampering with God's natural order, genetic engineering and cloning is us playing God, and we could potentially be creating beings with enhanced abilities that mirror the traits of the Nephilim. I mean, this could all be part of Satan's plan to condition us for what's coming. I mean, look at media, how all movies are focused on these superheroes that seem to be hybrids. We have werewolves, vampires, figures like Spider-Man. All of this is conditioning us to not just be okay with this altering of our blood, this hybridization, but to want that for ourselves. And then we have transhumanism, where the goal is to augment or transcend human limitations through technology, which parallels the ancient hybridization described in Genesis. Could genetic engineering, cloning, or even artificial intelligence lead to the creation of superhumans or beings that blur the line between humanity and something otherworldly? I don't know, but it all seems kind of odd that this stuff is going on again. Perhaps this desire by mankind, this conditioning, is opening people up to accept an alien deception. Perhaps we've already opened a portal from the spiritual to the physical, leading to a final deception. Who knows? But back to the question, why would Satan want the Nephilim to return? Some believe it's all part of his plan to create a perfect chimera, or human-animal creature that he could indwell as the beast mentioned in Scripture. I don't know. I mean, it's all very interesting stuff, but do I believe that there are Nephilim among us now? No, I don't believe that. Do I believe they could return? Yes, they could return, but I also think that when Satan first put in his plan to corrupt the human bloodline, it was to stop God's plan from unfolding, for his Messiah to come to save us from our sins and to die, and Jesus already did that. He won the battle already. Now he's just returning for his final judgment. Could Satan try to put in a plan to create these otherworldly beings, these for a deception, so that we could look at them as some sort of Messiah and turn from Christ? That's a possibility. Could he be creating these beings for the final battle? Maybe, but I don't see how any sort of creatures could even have a chance at defeating God. So I don't know. What do you guys think? This is just really interesting stuff, and I know that I'm not an expert in this. I'm just presenting to you what I found. But tell me what you think. Let me know, what did I miss? And what else on this topic would be interesting to talk about in a future video? That's what I like to hear. But in the meantime, you guys take care and God bless.